Absolutely delighted to welcome our speakers tonight and all of you, lots of people in this panel, in this event tonight. This is the second event that's organized by the Center for Democratic Future, which is an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary team of academics. It's based at Southampton University. And all of us are interested in thinking about democracy and thinking about the threats to democracy and investigating possible strategies to think about the future of democracy. I co-chair the center with Matt Ryan, who's currently on the screen, I think, and Silke Roth, who's next to, on my screen, she's next to Matt. What we're doing today is we're celebrating LGBT plus History Month. And so we are thinking about the relationship between LGBT plus communities and democracy. And the panel that we have today includes three experts who will discuss the broad topic of democratic futures and the LGBT plus community, or maybe we should say communities. I wonder whether that's going to come up. Looking back and looking ahead. And I'm just going to briefly introduce, and I'm sure not do justice to our three speakers. We have Dr. Phillip Ayoub, who's Associate Professor of Diplomacy and World Affairs at Occidental College in California, but who's now a visiting scholar at the moment in Berlin. And Philip's work focuses on transnational politics, gender, and social movements. And he'll tell us a lot more about his work in a moment. In order and no importance, obviously, the second speaker is Dr. Awino Okech, who's reader in gender studies at SOAS. And Awino's work lies in nexus between gender, sexuality, security, and nation state in conflict and post-conflict societies. I believe we have our third speaker. Yes? Maybe not, but I'll introduce him nonetheless.
We're missing short at the moment, yeah.
I'll introduce him nonetheless. We are waiting for Dr. Stuart Turnbull Dugarte, his lecturer in political science at Southampton, and brings to the panel an expertise in the divergent preferences and political behavior of LGBT plus individuals. And the way we're going to structure the panel today, we've sent the speakers three broad questions that they will address in turn, starting from the first, and they will bring their expertise to each question. They'll talk to the question according to their own research interests. And then we'll have, at the end of the three questions, we'll have a Q&A session. We are recording the panel. We will not record the Q&A session, so that if people want to ask questions in person, but don't want to be recorded, they can do that. But you can also post your questions in the chat as we go, and we'll read it. We'll read them at the end. Okay, I'm gonna give the panelists the floor. I think we'll start with Philip, and then Awino, and then Stuart. And the first question that the panel was asked to address was, what do current crises of democracy mean for LGBT plus communities?
All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction, Valentina. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be here with this exceptional group of scholars, and Awino and Stu, but also I want to thank Silke, Valentina, and Matt for their hard work in organizing this important roundtable and for inviting me. And I have to say, thinking about these three questions that we got in advance, they're quite big questions, and it's a bit of a daunting task to think about how to address them in a few minutes, in 5 minutes each in these rounds. So I've kind of mapped out some bullet points and short reactions based on my recent work. I'm going to start a little bit broad in this first question, but then maybe I can narrow in my answers to the next questions. They hang together a little bit. And then of course in the Q&A, we can go at it together with the audience and build from there. But so first, when I was thinking about this word crisis in democracy, I think I want to talk about it both in terms of crisis in democracy, but also in terms of how that interacts with other crises that are relevant for crisis in democracy. If we think of the financial crisis of the Great Recession, or the so-called migration crisis, or the current health crisis related to COVID-19, all of which impact LGBTQI people and LGBTQ futures. So as the theme of the panel rightly points out, the success that the LGBTQ movement has had in the last 2 decades, which is something that I've also written about a lot or written about the most, and we'll return to later, that has come against the backdrop of notable crises of rights and also crises of equality that play into democratic backsliding, nationalism, populism. And the crises that we've seen in recent years have overshadowed some of these movement gains because of the spotlight they place on the persistent oppression of LGBTQ peoples across societies, and the fact that LGBTQ norms continue to provoke resistance, and that transnational advocacy that has championed these kind of norms and rights has only diffused to certain parts of the globe and certain parts of society. So there's a lot to talk about and a lot to worry about, and I decided to focus on 3 points, that I'd like to address at the beginning. And one of the worries is that in terms of the gains that we've reached, they only affect certain LGBT people who've benefited more from the rights revolution than others. And I think this is something that we have to persistently keep in mind when we think intersectionally about rights, but also think about power hierarchies, not just between the LGBT community and broader society, but also within LGBT community itself, and thinking about how certain rights and gains have affected, upper middle class white gay men or have benefited them in different ways than other members of our community, and that the rising inequalities that we see with the crises that we're facing might exacerbate those kind of gaps and hierarchies also within our communities. So that's one thing that I want to keep coming back to. Another point that I want to make that relates a lot to my own work on transnational mobilization is that we see with a crisis in democracy, we see also global norm polarization, where we see illiberal forces that have pushed back against the rapid diffusion of LGBT rights norms that many of us celebrate. And so we see a concerning trend in which dominant alternative norms emerge, for example, ones growing out of this traditional values politics spearheaded by certain governments, or as example, like religious liberty bills or so-called anti-gay propaganda laws, which are diffusing to many countries, or rhetoric opposed to gender or /LGBT ideology, so-called gender ideology, which has really targeted the place of women and LGBT people in our societies. And these produce formidable challenges to LGBTQ people. And if I think of it from my own country, since I've spent a lot of time in the US these last 4 years, you have to keep in mind that according to GLAAD's Trump Accountability Project, the Trump-Pence administration rolled back over 180 protections for LGBT communities in just 4 years. And of course, some of those are being reversed now, but when we talk about the extent of these the impacts, it's really serious. And connecting to my first point, it's also more serious for some communities than others, given that a lot of those rollbacks in the US case were targeting trans communities in particular in the US. And then my third point is that LGBT people continue to be very vulnerable communities in the face of these crises surrounding nationalism, populism, the health crisis, austerity, and they're affected in many ways. And we can think of this in that LGBTQ people continue to be at particularly high risk of poverty based on high rates of societal isolation, which we think of a lot also in this last COVID year. There's high levels of discrimination in terms of access to services, education, housing, health, a greater likelihood of not having familial support networks to come into play during times of crisis, higher rates of unemployment, a pay gap, limited recognition of rights, which lead to unequal access to benefits and rights. For example, if we think of relationship recognition and how closing borders might even separate families and relate it to this most recent crisis. So these are persistent ways that crises are felt by LGBTQ people, and that I will return to in my responses to the later questions. But I want to have one final point I want to make in this one, an overarching point, which is something that came to me while I was thinking about this, this discussion of crisis of democracy. And I was thinking about, I've been giving talks for almost 15 years now, and crisis is almost always the theme in these talks. And I was thinking, when has democracy really not been a crisis for LGBTQ people? Or when are we nostalgic of this good democracy that was inclusive or great for LGBTQ people? And so I think that we have to keep that in mind, that I don't really remember a period when LGBT folks haven't been in some kind of crisis. And I think that that's something that we have to keep in mind, and it's something that holds both good and bad news. The bad news being that LGBTQ people or many LGBTQ people and many parts of LGBT communities are constantly in crisis. And the good news is that there's a lot of experience navigating such crises, which is something that LGBTQ people are constantly doing, that movements are constantly doing in terms of navigating their space and surroundings, but also how to advocate for their positions in societies. And I think part of the reason that crisis might feel so pronounced now is because it has folded in also other groups it has also challenged some astonishing gains the LGBT movement has made, but it also has, these crises impact broader society. I mean, if we think of the HIV/AIDS crisis, governments didn't do anything for a decade, and it was seen as kind of okay because it was affecting mainly marginalized communities, whereas a couple months into government inaction with the COVID crisis, and everyone sounds alarmed. It rightly sounds alarmed. I mean, it was terrible, but to think that how crises can mean different things. And here I think a lot about Dara Stralovich's work, who has a fantastic new book project. And also I think there's an article that she had out a couple of years ago called about man sessions and he coveries, where we have to think about when we talk about crises is that we think of crises when they affect more dominant cis het racial majority communities. And it's something to keep in mind that LGBTQ communities are navigating these crises all the time. So I'll end my first question remarks there.
Thank you, Philip. Awino, mic to you next.
Thank you. And let me join Philip in also thanking the hosts for the invitation to reflect together on the sets of questions that you've put forward. I want to build on a number of the points that Philip has raised, but let me begin with 3 short stories. So in February of 2020, just as many of us were becoming alive to COVID-19 and its global impact and the fact that this was not something that was happening far off away from us, I was supposed to travel to Mexico for some work. And for a range of reasons, I chose not to travel. And part of those reasons were informed by my own increasing concern around the number of countries that were beginning to shut down their borders, but also to stop flights coming into the country. And even though I'm a Kenyan citizen working in the United Kingdom, I remember telling a friend that I'm not going to travel to Mexico. And if by the time I'm done with my work in Mexico, the Mexican government says it has now shut its borders, no flights are leaving, the minute that happens, the British government is likely to send British Airways or whatever airline to come and collect British citizens. It is at that moment that this little card that I hold that gives me the right to work in the United Kingdom will cease to matter. So the fact that I work in this country will be ignored because that card will likely mean less than the maroon passport that citizens of this particular country hold. And I drew connections to the fact that when Ebola, particularly the wave of Ebola in Liberia and Sierra Leone, that hit those 2 countries and then spread to various parts of the African continent was happening, many Africans were dying at a very high rate. And then one day we miraculously discovered that somebody had been sitting on a vaccine for Ebola, and which was not made available. And I think that even at this particular moment, as we see the rush to vaccines in connection to COVID-19, we are consistently drawn to the ways in which race, capital, and class function together to always produce different kinds of crises for very specific bodies. And this is the point that Philip is raising very powerfully. So what therefore does this mean for queer communities, if I use that umbrella term? And I want to signal 3 crises that I want to focus on. What COVID-19 has shown the world, which is the very, very high rates of global inequalities. It doesn't matter whether you're a developed country or not. Sitting in London, we have witnessed the ways in which people are rendered homeless, unable to have good quality housing, the rising numbers of domestic violence, amongst other things. So this notion of development has ceased to matter. The insurrection in the United States, again, was a powerful reminder of the idea of this American exceptionalism being this myth, and the notion of democratic politics, voting and systems as ways of transitioning one senior patriarch into power over another is something that is flawed and needs revisiting. But also connected to that was a very powerful movements for Black lives in the summer of 2020 that again forced the world to stop for a minute and pay attention to anti-Blackness very specifically, not racism writ large, but anti-Blackness very specifically as a form of racism that continues to be deeply pernicious, even as we talk about anti-racist work across communities of color. For me, put together, this particular crisis point to the ways in which how we live and travel in the world is deeply embodied, because ultimately the health crisis wrought on us by COVID-19 is an embodied experience. Your class position, your gendered positioning renders you vulnerable in very specific ways than other people positioned slightly differently on the axis of race, class, and gender. But it has also drawn to our attention, the fact that, a point that has been made by various waves of activists, if you will, around the fact that we cannot continue to think about queer organizing or feminist organizing or anti-racism organizing in isolated ways. And that you must, of necessity, connect the ways in which struggles for queer freedom, struggles for freedom for women is deeply connected to how states are functioning, is deeply connected to the very embodied ways that states think about their survival, and the ways in which states think about these notions of citizenship and who has a right to what. So the debates around gender identity and anti-gender ideology and anti-gender work that is happening across Europe and America is very much a conversation about the body. It's very much a conversation about what is written on the body. It's very much a conversation about gender as it is about sexual orientation, and how upon that, racialized ideas about who belongs and who does not belong are layered on top of it. And I guess the fundamental point that I'm making, that if we look at these the 3 crises that I'm signaling out, because they really take us to the structural inequalities that also bind queer movements, the insurrection in the US and American exceptionalism, COVID-19 and the way it has globally bound us, and Black Lives Matter. We are forced to think much more deeply about transnational organizing. We are forced much more deeply to think about the nexus between race, capitalism, white supremacy, capitalism, and gender as critical points around which we think about social transformation, structural transformation, but also as critical points around which we organize and mobilize across movements. And for me, I think that is the core message. That is the message that I have received in looking at this crisis and experiencing them. That is the core message that I see movements thinking about. Because when you examine the End SARS protest, which is a protest that was happening in Nigeria in October of 2020, challenging police brutality, you saw all these flags of queer movements, or the rainbow flag out on the street. 2 days ago or a day ago, I saw a picture on Twitter in Myanmar, again, queer movements out on the streets. My question is that I know that's symbolically important, but where did you think they would be? Right? Queer people do not exist in enclaves in their society. They're part and parcel of those societies experiencing those very forms of exclusion, layered as well in connection with the sexual orientation or their gender identity. So to single it out is important symbolically, of course, but it forces us to ask the question, why do we think of our organizing in very siloed, disparate ways in 2021? What is the work that we need to be doing to challenge feminist movements, to challenge movements working on questions of class, our trade unions, our labor movements, to think much more cohesively about how to deal and to dismantle these three pillars that sustain the inequalities that we're working against. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. And Awino, I'm so excited about the first question. Before we move to the second, we've heard from the third speaker who sends us deep apologies. He's had an emergency and he won't be able to join us today. So we'll continue with Philip and Awino, and then we'll have more time, I guess, for Q&A at the end. So our next question is, sorry, just posting it. What are the opportunities and obstacles to forming coalitions for LGBT plus communities to address these crises? Again, a broad question that our speakers can address as they wish. Philip, do you want to go first or Awino first?
Sure, I can if that's okay with Awino, then we'll just continue in that order. Yeah. Yeah, I really actually want to build off of several points, the fantastic points that Awino just made, which I really, I was thinking, I'm thinking that my comments that I have now connect there as well, because I think while this might be a little bit optimistic, I do think that there are potentials for a kind of intersectionally linked fate moving forward out of these crises. And I think that crisis in that sense offers both a kind of a threat, but also an opportunity. And I want to focus my remarks to this question a little bit on what those opportunities could be. And I'm going to base that on a somewhat recent survey of experts, of movement organizer experts in different LGBT movements in Europe that I collected data on for an article that came out last year in Social Politics. And those surveys with those movement organizers gave some cause for optimism in line with what feminist and Black scholarship has seen in terms of political intersectionality in our social justice movements, and the potential for maybe an intersectional consciousness can also be moved by some of these crises. And one of the observations that a lot of organizers were telling me, at least in the surveys, is that the crisis has caused them to think more about alliance building and coalitions with other groups. And there's a few ways, and I want to give a few examples of how they said that works. And I want to note at the outset that a lot of this pertains to kind of an intersectional consciousness and effort. It doesn't always mean that it has worked out smoothly on the ground. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, that the effort it takes to build these kind of alliances and coalitions, but the initiative to do so has risen, and there have also been some concrete examples that we can talk about. And so why is that happening, or why can crisis be that kind of an opportunity? And one of the things that organizers said was that rising nationalism and democratic backsliding can also provoke a sense of shared threat that connects groups in certain ways across difference. And I mean, I should note here that nationalism has always been a threat to LGBTQ people, just as it has been because gender, race, sexuality really destabilize fixity of national identity in ways that that provoke responses of threat by these communities. So that when this kind of nationalism is so overt, that this can provoke a kind of a shared threat. I'll talk later in my next response to the question also about homonationalism, which is the other side of this coin. But for now, let me remain slightly optimistic. So what a lot of them were saying in the survey was that crisis leads to these more xenophobic political climates, which can make multiple discrimination and a sense of a shared threat more visible, generating an intersectional consciousness, and that the political shift to the right has posed some new questions and also reverberated in activist networks that made the LGBTQ movement, more aware of some of its most marginalized members, illuminating the struggles that they're faced with. And that's something we can look at least in terms of a consciousness level, in terms of the programming of different organizations and how they talk about themselves, where we have seen changes in how they talk about their struggle in a more intersectional way. Another thing that was kind of interesting that surprised me was that because we think of crisis also leading to resource scarcity, and here especially the financial crisis would be one way that we could think that, but there too organizers saw that it is actually in kind of a surprising way or paradoxical way altered donor requirements and has incentivized cross-movement alliances for the LGBTQ movement in certain ways. So in a way, competition for resources has emphasized working together on intersectionality, on multiple discrimination. So the organizers have incorporated some of this into their work and have, done funding campaigns together and worked on different initiatives together. And while crisis might limit funds and resources, one of the things that LGBT movement organizers noted repeatedly was that the movement was so underfunded and so volunteer-based, and we do have data to back that up before the financial crisis, that it wasn't really like they saw a major loss in resources due to crisis. They weren't flushed with resources before. So as the issue became more prominent globally, it didn't coincide with as much financial resource loss as we would have anticipated. And then finally, another theme that, and this is not from this article, but from my book in 2016, and also I think done better in a book by Conor O'Dwyer called Backlash that came out in 2018, is this idea that resistance, while, and I want to emphasize that a lot, while it is, not something to celebrate in the sense that backlash and resistance creates serious violence towards LGBT individuals, that for the movement or for the group, resistance can also sometimes galvanize movements. And there is this argument that where a contestation occurs, that sometimes movements are galvanized in response. There's many examples of this, but one of the cases, that I've studied more often, which is the Polish case study. We've seen one of, the most organized and successful LGBTQ movements in Europe, even though they are facing, as we all know from the news, really active resistance in terms of democratic backsliding. It's a key case when it comes to how LGBT communities are affected, yet the movement is very strong. And that's something in O'Dwyer's work. He compares it, for example, to the Czech Republic, where the LGBT movement had some successes in the mid-2000s with less opposition or backlash. And then really there was a period of demobilization. And so that resistance and connecting back to my first points, that LGBT movements are constantly in struggle, it doesn't necessarily mean that these crises will result in weaker movement organizing. I'll stop my response there.
Thanks, Philip. Awino.
Yeah, again, really much in the spirit of building, I want to speak on the question of finances and under-resourcing of movements, and to just lift up what we have seen, what I have observed across sections of the African continent, but also, in sections of the US, especially amongst Black organizers, which is around the evolution of mutual aid support systems, right? So when states fail, when the kinds of resources that we're looking for in relation to donor funding are non-existent, we know from our own traditions of organizing that mechanisms to support one another are the things that movements have always fallen back to as part of a way of surviving despite the conditions that are put before us. So I think lifting up mutual aid as a mechanism that has been developed utilized rather by queer movements is an important one in connection to the question of coming together to solve crisis or to respond to crisis. And a lot of this work is work that is happening across movements. The second thing that I want to say is that I come from a tradition of feminist organizing that recognizes the value of autonomous organizing. Now there's the importance of creating autonomous spaces, and then there's the need to recognize the transnational organizing and cross-movement work that needs to be done. And I think sometimes we tend to conflate or try to ignore why autonomous spaces exist. And imagine that to do that, to set up autonomous spaces, is to argue that groups are being a little bit too insular, are playing into identity politics. This is something that I hear a lot, and are not interested in broadening the ways in which they think about change strategies. But no, I think autonomous spaces serve a particular purpose of rejuvenation, of re-strategizing, of thinking. There are spaces within which you do not have to constantly explain why this particular idea, or why this particular approach, or why this particular experience is, for instance, queerphobic, or why this particular experience is racist to groups that are still coming to their own in terms of understanding these experiences, because they're not part of those groups. And so for me, I want to emphasize that even though I will urge and call for better transnational organizing, that should not displace autonomous spaces and autonomous sites of organizing, because they're absolutely essential for movement survival. They're absolutely essential for the health of social movements, because transnational work, as Philip was alluding to, and cross-movement organizing is difficult work. It is work that is extremely emotionally taxing and demanding extreme emotional labor from groups that are already marginalized and extracted from on a daily basis. The third point that I want to make is linked to a point that Philip raised at the very beginning, which is about groups that have always existed in crisis. States and the nations within which we belong have never been necessarily friendly to queer communities. And so this is just yet another crisis, that groups have already been dealing with in different forms. And this for me is the point about learning, right? Because we can revert this question to say, what is it that other organizers can learn from queer organizers in relation to thinking about crisis? Because they are quite adept at this. In the same way, there were lots of jokes, that were coming out of the African continent, telling the Americans, okay, hold up a minute, we can come and help you with this problem, because clearly, you don't know how to deal with it, because you've been so busy creating problems elsewhere that you have no tools to understand what it means to deal with the repercussions of the crisis that you have created. I'm making the point that there is an opportunity to invert this question about what can queer movements do to come and form coalitions, to recognize that queer movements have always historically been working in coalition. It has always been simply a fact of lifting up the questions of queerness, lifting up the question of LGBTQI within feminist spaces and within labor movements, and not that that form of organizing has happened outside of those spaces necessarily. And this is true for many parts of the African continent, where what has happened is the demand for other movements to take up those issues as part of their organizing, rather than the fact that queer groups do not exist within those movements. So there are lessons to be learned, as Philip was pointing out earlier, that queer movements have been doing this work already. So how can we help other movements think much more broadly about the ways in which they organize?
Great. So let's move on to the third question, and then we'll take questions from the audience at the end. The third question asked, thinking about the future of democracy, what are LGBT plus or LGBTQA, QI, etc. communities doing right, in inverted commas, and what they're doing wrong, again, in inverted commas?
Great. So I'm going to answer that question in a second, but since we have time, a little bit more time, I did also want to piggyback on a few things that Awino mentioned in her comments, which I found really important, and I wanted to connect back to what I said. But with this intersectional consciousness has precisely come this need for autonomous spaces that Awino mentioned. We have many examples for that. If you think of the European Lesbian Conference, which has emerged with more power, or if you think of organization Intersex International or TGEU on trans organization. It's not that these groups are all working together in the same spaces, even though there are umbrellas for that too, like ILGA, which is the International Lesbian, Gay, Bi, Trans, and Intersex Association. But there has been seen the need to talk about these issues in autonomous spaces and then broker connections when the time is right and on issues that are right. So this is absolutely, that is part of this theme that I see as positive and a way to expand and for also other groups to learn from, and within the LGBT community as well. In terms of this question now, the third question, in terms of thinking about what LGBT communities are doing right and what they're doing wrong, I want to start with the question of what they're doing right, because I think that there are some things, and there's a huge asterisk to what they're doing right, because it still concerns me very much, as we've already pointed out, that there are power hierarchies within these communities of LGBT people and in terms of the way we fought for rights, that also privilege certain groups. That said, there are tremendous successes that have come about from LGBT organizing. If we think of change in attitudes, and this doesn't span to the whole globe, but if we look in terms of issues that we've seen attitudinal change, or we've seen proliferation of new kinds of innovative rights legislation. There's really a lot of things that have happened in the last 2 decades with speed and suddenness that LGBTQ movements have accomplished and brought about. And I think that that's something we also need to address, and also can say that it's something that other movements can learn from. And again, to piggyback on Awino's points, I mean, I have seen a really a strong factor for transnational organizing in this way. And it's a double-edged sword, and I'll get later to the negatives behind it. But LGBT groups have since the mid-1800s been organizing across borders. And that is, even though there's very specific identities that don't travel across borders, there are some shared experiences that queer communities that have brought queer communities together in the past and continue to do so, to organize across borders in certain ways. And I think that this, this was really the focus of my 2016 book, is that these transnational ties and channels across borders have been able to bring about certain gains in a movement, and even in surprising places. If you think of, Catholic Ireland would vote for marriage equality, that's definitely not something we saw coming just 20 years ago, and it happened in 2015. Or if you think of Malta, which has another Catholic island, which has the top spot on the LGBTI index, including on trans recognition in the world. And so what explains these kind of changes, that have happened? And a lot of our earlier scholarship was really focused on domestic factors. So states that could reach this level would have to be, quite secular. They'd have to be very strong democracies. They'd have to be rich. And it would put a lot of focus on kind of the Scandinavian states or the Benelux states as kind of the states that have the conditions with which that could happen. But what that did is, I think that ignored in part these transnational linkages that would allow for major transformations in the rights revolution in other kinds of contexts, in many different continents, and also in many different states that we would have deemed less likely to meet those criteria. And those kind of channels that have come about have been seen in kind of a visionary way, I think, by queer organizers early on as a potential to use platforms, transnational platforms, to organize and to press for rights. And you can see that, for example, in more recent history, if you look in the 70s with the formation of ILGA, where activists were already thinking about using the European institutions as a way to incorporate and push for LGBTI rights from the top down, even before they really had a mandate for social policies, when these IOs were more focused on economic integration. And so we've seen, and before ILGA too, there were other examples, the World Congress for Sexual Reform in the early 20th century, or in the post-war period, the ISC, as examples of this kind of transnational organizing. And so these channels have found a way to put pressure on states to, by joining political clubs like the EU or the UN, to introduce new kinds of rights. It came quite late, but in the last couple decades have come to include LGBTI people. They also have created, social channels of exchange across borders through the media that can introduce new ideas of understanding oneself across various contexts. And then importantly, through transnational organizing, they've created kind of brokered transnational channels that connect people across borders and activists across borders working on these issues. And this is where, in my book, I talk a lot about more brokerage, which really centers, again, local groups that are connected in these transnational ways, but still really understand and work on the ground, because LGBTI rights are contentious. Their identities are laden with a lot of values, whether connected to the West or to certain countries. And they have to be, they're not talked about in the same way everywhere. And they have to be framed and grafted, even within the European context, which is a little bit my limit, because that's the region that I work on the most. And even within Europe, you have such different ways of talking about these identities, and these kind of transnational channels have to be brokered and mediated all the time. But they have done something right in that way, in that they have, if you think of an issue like marriage equality, which was radical and seen as radical, well, actually it was also seen as very conservative, and a lot of queer movements didn't want it at all. But in terms of a type of policy, it existed nowhere until Denmark in 1989 with partnership, and then the Netherlands in 2001 with full marriage equality. Yet when I talk to my students, they assume that that's kind of been around forever, even though the US, despite our exceptionalism, didn't get it until 2015. And these kind of rights, the fact that they now exist in multiple dozens of countries have something to do with transnational currents. It's not just domestic factors that explain this. And I think here is something that the LGBT movement has taught or can teach other movements, including, unfortunately, it also is something that the opposition to LGBT rights has mimicked, because there too you see these interesting conglomerations of powerful states, like the Russian state is an example a lot when it comes to so-called LGBT propaganda laws, in cahoots with various IOs like the Orthodox or Catholic Church, and then INGOs like the World Congress of Families that also work in multiple contexts to promote other kinds of discriminatory laws. So, and that we've seen an acceleration of in the last decade, for sure. So there are successes, to talk about, but there's also things that, we can caution about what we've done wrong or what the movement has done wrong and what can be learned from. And that's where, with this transnational organizing, it's a double-edged sword in that, the top-down kind of implementation without involving groups, which is sometimes happens, can lead to a lot of pushback and violence, because groups on the ground really need to decide when they can be visible or not, or when they should be visible or not. And that's something that I think sometimes even well-intentioned transnational organizers, if it fails to involve people on the ground and local groups on the ground, it can lead to also the risk of fanning the flames of backlash. And then another thing in terms of what could potentially go wrong, or what at least this crisis in democracy worries me as I watch the last US election and have followed politics in recent years, is a concept, that comes from queer theory on homonationalism. Thinkers like Jasbir Puar, who have written about this, in that, as we get this good news of being incorporated into rights and some members of the LGBT community getting to be seen as part of the nation, which didn't exist before, that this can then also mean that we might be susceptible to other kinds of exclusionary or imperial or racist, or more susceptible to those with this process of homonationalism. And that's something, for example, with our third speaker who couldn't be here today, Stu, and I, with Zain Marib and Gab Magni, wrote a piece in the Washington Post where we were analyzing how the Trump campaign was really, despite what I mentioned before of 180 rollbacks to LGBT communities, was catering in their campaign to LGBTI voters, with mainly gay men voters and a little bit gay and lesbian voters. But they had this theme called Trump Pride campaigns. And they were gathering and talking to these groups in a way that was, using this like old playbook of framing migrants, vilifying migrants as quote unquote homophobic and targeting other countries. Rick Grinnell, Trump's ambassador to Germany, had this campaign to decriminalize homosexuality, which I guess sounds good on paper, even though the Trump administration actually didn't know about it at first and did almost nothing to actually help that happen. It was really the way that Rick Grinnell, the Trump official behind it, talked about it, really used LGBT rights as a weapon to vilify certain countries. So Iran came up a lot in a very kind of aggressive, almost to justify war kind of way, where LGBTI was used. And so I think a lot of, in terms of what could go wrong, is the fear that LGBTI people, or that some LGBTI people, could join again, as in other periods of history, this kind of right-wing narrative and rhetoric in greater numbers. And I think we still have mixed evidence on how much this is happening or not. And what we saw with the Trump campaign is that a lot of it was still used. A lot of this, faux LGBTI rights language was used to kind of appeal to cishet conservatives who wanted to feel better about themselves, more than actually really turning out masses of LGBT voters. But there were, there were exit polls that suggested that LGBT voters were turning out in greater numbers for these kind of parties. And it's something that it's not only the US, we obviously here in Germany with the AfD, we have a lesbian co-chair who uses this kind of language. We definitely seen that in right-wing parties in the Netherlands. And so I think, I think that this is part of what can go wrong when we lose sight of that kind of intersectional focus that Awino was talking about in her remarks. And I think there is, during this period of democratic backsliding, the potential for that to happen more and more. And it has happened also in other parts in history. It's not the first time that we're talking about these things, but it's something that we have to keep an eye on quite carefully. So I'm sorry to talk so long. I allowed myself to go a little bit longer given the extra time, but I'll definitely stop now.
But by all means, Awino, do take more time if you wish. We have some extra time. So
yes, so let's say two main things that I want to lift up. Whenever I used to, I no longer teach that module now, but whenever I taught the module Queer Politics in class, one of the arguments, students would always bring back is around why claim rights, right? The well-worn critiques around, the limitations of the human rights framework and all of these dynamics. But I think there's something lost, and this is something that I always ask my students to think about. There is something lost in this very homogenizing way of thinking about the human rights framework and what those who choose that as an avenue to speak back to the state are doing. We miss what it is that they're doing by claiming that language, by claiming the spaces that movements, feminist movements, queer movements have sought to open up as avenues for formally engaging with governments and intergovernmental bodies. So consequently, I want to just lift up the work that I've seen happening across the African continent in 2019-20, particularly around using strategic litigation as a mechanism to challenge all penal codes around the criminalization of homosexuality. And these laws exist, as I'm sure many of you know, in various fashions across different former colonies on the African continent. They remain largely at the current moment within former British colonies, and which are named in various ways, laws against the carnal order of nature. And in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, in Namibia, in Botswana, I believe, those are the three countries where we saw a range of work by movements to challenge these laws, a move to get those laws out of the books. On paper, reading it on the surface, it is easy to argue that, well, that does not necessarily change the conditions for queer people in the country. But what we fail to see in that process is a movement that is taking the state on its own terms, using its own language to push back against laws that do not make sense, given the constitutional rights that they've put in place in one section of the Constitution. So there's some savviness that we are seeing here in terms of using the very language of the oppressor to dismantle the very systems that the oppressor is using to prop up particular ideas of freedom. Now, of course, we can extend that, in various spaces to think about what kinds of freedoms does that buy, what forms of justice does it create. But my argument is that this kind of strategic litigation is not necessarily designed to open up new vistas of freedom in the ways in which we want to see it. But what it does do is push back against a state that has created particular mechanisms and has adopted laws that were inherited from a colonial government as their own, as a means to rewrite and reorient heterosexuality as the primary way through which, for instance, Africans are defined and how Africans exist in our societies. Linked to that has been an increasing level of collaboration with health rights movements and feminist movements around this particular subject. Because as I've always argued, and I'm sure many queer scholars make this argument, the minute homophobia is put on the table, what is also put on the table is conservative interpretations of heterosexuality. Those things go hand in hand. So your freedoms as this free woman who chooses not to have children, chooses not to get married, is dismantling patriarchy every day that she wakes up, is taken away from you the minute governments and rogue politicians and members of parliament start shouting homophobia. Because to claim homosexuality is a problem, is a sin, and all of these things. To claim homosexuality is equally an attempt to reclaim particular ideas of femininity and masculinity. It's equally an opportunity to push back against all of the work that has been done around sexual rights and HIV/AIDS, and work with other populations, as they call it in the health field, work with sex workers, men who sleep with men, etc. We can trouble that terminology. But what it does is to foreclose the opportunities for health rights, the opportunities for a whole range of freedoms that other movements have won. And so we are seeing the bridge being closed much more because of the expansive way in which these anti-homosexuality bills clamp everyone together, including those who are doing work on violence against women. So for me, that is something to be celebrated, because what we saw in Uganda, for instance, in 2013, 2014, 2015, with the infamous Bahati bill, was a moment where all movements sat back and said, listen, I can no longer do this thing of saying, those queer people, I don't know what they're talking about. That's my Christianity does not allow me to engage with that, because your own work around violence, your own work around health was under threat. And people had to set aside all of these moralistic arguments to defend the broader space for work around sexual rights that was being lost as a result of these wide-ranging anti-homosexuality bills. So really what I'm surfacing here are the strategic opportunities that queer organizers across the African continent are using in terms of the law, strategic litigation work that's happening within the framework of the legal system, as a way of setting precedent, as a way of pushing back against governments using their own language and using their own institutions. Part of this work has also been seen, for instance, in intergovernmental policy spaces. So the work that was done by the Coalition of African Lesbians to seek observer status within the African Commission for People and Human Rights. Now, if you talk to CAL activists, they will tell you we're not really interested in what happens in that space. But what we wanted to do was challenge the ways in which that particular body sees who African citizens are, who African civil society is, and who has a right to observer status or to think and work around questions of gender equality. And so the push and the consistent, they got observer status. The observer status was rescinded by the African Heads of State Summit. And what CAL subsequently did in collaboration with ISLA, the Institute for Strategic Litigation in Africa, was to argue against, it no longer was arguing about CAL's observer status as a lesbian organization, but instead it lifted the conversation to the independence of these institutions. If you have set up the Africa Commission on People as Human Rights as an independent body, Now, remember all of the conversations we've been having around the International Criminal Court, how it targets Africans disproportionately or Black people disproportionately. If the African Commission of People and Human Rights and the African Court are supposed to be independent bodies that allow us to try our people on our own soil, how independent are they? So the CAL push for observer state had opened up a different argument around independence of institutions and broader engagements around questions of governance. Again, you saw an opportunity for bridge building across movements that would never have ordinarily bothered to engage with what the CAL, Coalition of African Lesbians Observer Status meant. The final point that I want to make, and this is a big debate between a colleague of mine and I, which is that the gap between queer theorizing and queer movements. And my feeling that sometimes we have queered theory so much that we no longer know what it is doing anymore. And queer movements are sitting on this end, you know, challenging and building queer theory through their work. But queer theory that we are teaching in class and the books that we are reading has no meaning, has no legibility for people's lives, right? Now, if we look back at the sort of history of queer theory, yes, influenced and shaped by queer movements, you know, and has always been, then took off into a different detour and is now doing different things. But if for scholars who are deeply invested in our scholarship, having meaning to the worlds in which we are living in, trying to shape and help imagine the societies that we want to live in and that we want to visualize, are we doing enough of that bridge building? Or is our scholarship targeted towards our peers? How much of that work is actually shaping? So even if our task is to tell queer movements or to argue or to push queer movements to say, ignore this kind of binaries that we're still setting up with lesbian, gay, you know, those are unhelpful categories, you know, to challenge the material conditions that might actually produce the importance of those categories, even if that is our work. Can we honestly argue that the bulk of queer theory that is being produced is effectively making that argument to the movements that we want to push to make those arguments? This is the challenge that I put on the table.
I wonder whether Philip wants to reply to this or.
Yeah, I would actually. I think it's a great challenge to put on the table, and I share it as well. I think that there is this gap that you notice when you speak between movements and go back to the ivory tower in between. And I think what's really well intentioned has been, actually, there's a recent book, Queer Palestine and the Empire of Critique, by my friend and colleague Saad Achan, who gets at this point that Awino just made quite powerfully, that she made quite powerfully. And he also addresses it in the book by taking this kind of critique of empire and switching it to empire of critique. And he actually makes the case that sometimes queer theory can also shackle movements on the ground, and that they're squeezed from the left and the right in their space for maneuver, and that we have, and it's not, I mean, he is also inspired by queer theory the same way that I am, and that many of us probably on the Zoom call are, but it really calls us to think carefully about how applicable our theories are for movements on the ground, and how we engage with them, and how we cut movements slack when they feel like those theories are out of touch with the lived experience of the constituents they represent. So this is something, I think, with the bridge building, I just want to, I guess all I can say is that, yes, I think that it really is, that should be a focus that those of us working on this issue in the academy need to think about really carefully.
Thank you both. I have questions, but in order not to abuse my position as chair, I know there are other people who want to ask questions. Estrella, well, actually, we should probably stop the recording now, because I think Matt is in charge of recording.